Hello and welcome back. I'm doing another solo recording, and today I wanted to talk about some things that I've been reading in the Old Testament in the Hebrew Bible and have found interesting. And I like reading the rabbinic commentaries. I have an Art Scroll Torah that has a lot of the commentaries, and these aren't so much commentaries of modern biblical scholarship, but commentaries from medieval scholars as they've been reading in the Torah and grappling with questions that come up. And one of the questions, that's a question that I've had actually, and something that the medieval scholars have dealt a lot with too, is why Moses, after all the work that he was doing with the children of Israel, after doing all that work to bring them out of Egypt and spending decades with them in the desert, why Moses wasn't permitted to enter into the Promised Land, even though he was the one who was tasked with bringing them to it. And it's definitely a big question and something that I've wondered and something that's come up a lot in the history of the biblical interpretation. And so what I thought I'd do today is first go through some of those sections of the Bible in Numbers 20, where it talks about that. What episode was it that brought this down? And then also the way that some of the commentators have grappled with this and some of the explanations that they have given. All right, so let's start in the Bible itself. Let's go to Numbers 20. And this is the verse that talks about Moses not being permitted to enter the Promised Land. This is Numbers chapter 20, verse 12. And I'll go ahead and read that in Hebrew and in English, and then I'll talk a little bit about it. So first in Hebrew. Vayomer Adonai al Moshe va'al Aharon ya'an lo ha'amantem bi l'hakdisheni le'enei bnei Yisrael lechen lo tabi'u et hakahal hazeh al haaretz asher natati lehem. Okay, and then from the King James translation. And the Lord spake unto Moses and Aaron, because ye believed me not to sanctify me in the eyes of the children of Israel, therefore ye shall not bring this congregation into the land which I have given them. So I guess you could say there's sort of an explanation there. It says, okay, because you did not believe in me to sanctify me, I will not bring you will not bring the children of Israel into the land. Okay, but what exactly does that mean? So let's go to the preceding verses, and we'll talk about what happened leading up to that. But before we do that, let's bring in one of the rabbinic commentators just to talk about this problem in general. And as I'm doing that, I want to show you a resource that I get all these commentaries from. So my primary source, I look in my Art Scroll Torah, and it has a lot of these commentaries, and that's where I first find out about them. But then when I'm reading one, it will refer to the source. And so, like if it has something from Rashi or even Ezra, I think, I want to read more about that. So I go to a website called Sefaria.org, and they have everything there. So you can go and you see they have the Bible. They have it there in an English translation. And of course, they have the Hebrew. You can switch back and forth between the English and Hebrew with the Bible. And that's pretty standard. You can get that in a lot of places. But what is really great about Sefaria is that they also have, on every verse, you can click on it, and you can get commentaries, Targum, Midrash, philosophical texts, pertaining to each verse. And so usually if I see something quoted, I can go to Sefaria and find it. Sometimes it takes a little bit of searching, but I can usually find it. And then so I'll show you if we go into the commentary, you see there are different sources. I just mentioned Rashi and even Ezra. Some of the other ones there are grayed out, meaning that they don't have commentary on the specific verse, but they'll usually have something. And then you go into each one. There's always a Hebrew text there, and for Most of the big ones, they'll have an English translation. So usually for Rashi, they'll have an English translation, and you can kind of toggle back and forth between the Hebrew and English if you can read Hebrew, and that's a great resource. So the first commentator that I want to look at is a guy named Nachmanides, and that's the Greek form of his name. His name was Moshe ben Nachman, or long form Rabbeinu Moshe ben Nachman. And what we see a lot with these commentators is that they're given shortened names. They're kind of nicknames. So his name is Rambam, and you got to keep. He could be, at least for me, easily confused with Rambam, with ending with an M, who is somebody else. That's Maimonides, who we'll also hear from a little bit later. But anyway, this is Nachmanides. He lived from 1194 to 1270, born in Spain, and died in the Kingdom of Jerusalem. So he said of this episode, the sin of Moses and Aaron at the waters of Meribah is not clearly expressed in Scripture. Okay, yep, that seems quite true. And he said, and the truth is that the matter is a big secret, sod gadol, from among the secrets of the Torah. I just like that quote there because it kind of sets up that, okay, this is an issue. So this is something interesting to get into. So now let's see what other commentators have said on it. So next, let's go to Rashi. Rashi's a really big name. Rashi is another one of these shortened names or nicknames that people can be known by. It's for Rabbi Shlomo Yitzhaki. And I kind of compare him to Augustine as a really big authoritative name within medieval Judaism. I haven't heard other people make that comparison. It's just a comparison that I make. So you can blame me for that. He was born and died in France and lived from 1040 to 1105. And before I get to his commentaries, something that I find kind of interesting about him is that sometimes not only he's really interesting for medievalists as well, because he wrote a lot in Hebrew, but also lived in France, right? So he spoke Old French, and sometimes will refer to different terms in Old French. So he's actually a resource for the linguistics of French in that time period. Another thing I'll mention about Rashi is that I don't know why exactly, but he had his own script that he used. So he didn't use the standard Hebrew letters in his writing. I mean, his letters are kind of close, but it's unique, and I can't read it. But fortunately, on Sefaria, they use the normal Hebrew script. So the first verse he talks about is Numbers 20:10. Backing up a little bit. So I'll go ahead and read the Hebrew first. And this is Moses talking to the people. Hamin hasela hazeh notzi lachem mayim. And so what that means is, shall we bring forth water for you from this rock? And what Rashi does, he's looking at these texts very closely, looking at each word, looking for something that's significant. And so what he narrows in on is this rock. And why this rock? Hazeh. What is it? Is that significant in some way? So here's what Rashi says in his commentary. They said this because they could not distinguish it, the rock intended by God, for the rock from which the water had hitherto flowed during these 40 years had vanished and taken a place amongst the other rocks when the well disappeared after Miriam's death. And Israel said to them, what difference is it to you from which rock you bring forth water for us? Okay, so something to recall here. So this is the second time that Moses is bringing water out of a rock. Okay, what Rashi's getting at here is that that Moses was supposed to bring forth water from this same rock that he had done it with the first time, but there had been some change in the land, and the rock had moved around. And so he was supposed to find the original rock, and how exactly he was to do this we'll get into. But it sounds like the people may have been impatient, or for whatever reason, he didn't pursue finding what the original rock was. Maybe the children of Israel were impatient, just said it doesn't matter which rock you bring it from, just bring forth water for us from whatever rock you can. And what might be happening here is that the implication was that Moses was supposed to go around speaking to rock after rock, and until he came upon the right one, that somehow in conversation with each rock, the right rock would have revealed itself to him. But the people's intemperance provoked him to anger, and one of Rashi's ideas here will be that Moses' anger was really what was the big cause of the problem here, and that's what was his error in judgment. So Moses did end up finding a rock, and he chose one to strike. And so let's read what happens in Numbers chapter 20, verse 11. Vayara Moshe et yado, vayak et hasele, b'matehu pa'amain, vayotseu maim rabim. And Moses lifted up his hand with his rod, he smote the rock twice, and the water came out abundantly, and the congregation drank, and their beasts also. Okay, so Rashi looks at this, and he notices again, with his close attention to detail and words, twice. Okay, why did he strike it twice? This is an interesting question. Okay, so Rashi says, because at the first attempt it did not bring forth more than a few drops, for God had not bidden him smite it, but he had said, and ye shall speak to the rock. They had indeed spoken, but to a different rock, not that which God had intended. And it had not given forth water. They said, perhaps it is necessary to smite it, as on the former occasion, when it says, and ye shall smite the rock, as it happened back in Exodus chapter 17, verse 6. And just that rock intended by God happened to be there, and they smote it. So once again, Rashi is paying close attention to detail here. And so he's going back to verse 8, where the Lord had said, take the staff and gather together the assembly, you and Aaron your brother, and speak to the rock before their eyes. Dibartem el hasele le'enehem. And so the Lord is making a point to Moses, okay, and, as I'm reading this here, in light of what Rashi has said, okay, you're supposed to speak to them before the eyes of the people. So Moses, it looks like the Lord may have intended for Moses to do something in the eyes of the people so that they could observe this and be witnesses to it, and that Moses didn't follow those instructions. So you could see here his reasoning. So Moses is going around, he can't find the original rock, and he thinks, okay, well, maybe if I had found the proper rock, speaking would have been sufficient, but since I can't find the exact rock, I may have to do something a little bit extra. Maybe I have to strike this one, so that, like I did last time back in the first instance that we read about in Exodus. And also you may have been reasoning, well, the Lord commanded me to take my staff with me, so there must be some reason to do that. And so he struck the rock, and maybe the first time there was just a little trickle of water, so then he had to strike it twice. But this wasn't exactly what Moses was supposed to have done. So we're seeing all these different instances in which Moses is not following precisely the word of the Lord.
Okay, I'll mention one more line from Rashi here, and this is going to transition us into our next commentator, Maimonides. So Rashi said, when he said, "Hear now, ye rebels," speaking to the children of Israel, he smote the rock. It was through his anger that he made the mistake. So this theory from Rashi being that what Moses' mistake was actually that he got angry with the children of Israel. So Maimonides talks about this a little bit more. So let's move on to Maimonides. So this is another medieval figure, Moses ben Maimon, and his nickname is Rambam, which is a shortened version of Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon. He lived from 1138 to 1204, born in Cordoba in what is today Spain, and died in Egypt. So here's a commentary from Rambam, or Maimonides. I'll just say that one. That's the one I'm more used to. All this, God said, although the sin of Moses consisted merely in that he departed from the moral mean of patience to the extreme of wrath, insofar as he exclaimed, "Hear now, ye rebels," etc. Yet for this God found fault with him, that such a man as he should show anger in the presence of the entire community of Israel, where wrath is unbecoming. However, we do not find that when God spoke to Moses about this matter, he was angry, but on the contrary said, "Take the staff and give drink to the congregation and their cattle." We have indeed digressed from the subject of this chapter, but have, I hope, satisfactorily solved one of the most difficult passages of Scripture concerning which there has been much arguing in the attempt to state exactly what the sin was which Moses committed. And that's from Maimonides' Commentaries, Shemone Perakim 4:13. So I quoted just one part of this, but before this passage, Maimonides had given a really extensive overview of all the different theories. And I would actually recommend going and looking that one up because it's even more comprehensive than what I'm getting into here. But then Maimonides felt that he had solved the issue and that he had come to the conclusion where everyone else had been faltering, and that his answer was, okay, the issue was God never indicated that he was angry with the children of Israel. All he did was he gave Moses these instructions. He said, take your staff, give drink to the congregation and their cattle, and that Moses was the one who got impatient, lost his temper, and that and started calling them names, calling them rebels, and that it was in this loss of temper and in being angry, and I think it implied here also that being God's representatives, that this would be a misrepresentation of God, that people could assume that God was also angry because Moses was angry, and so that's a big responsibility as well, and that was both something that both Rashi and Maimonides mentioned as a possible reason and explanation for what Moses' sin was here.
And I'll just go ahead and say for my part, this is my personal favorite explanation, because I kind of like the idea that God was the one who was more merciful and patient with the people, and that Moses was the one who made the mistake by getting angry. I think that would probably be appeal to a lot of us. Doesn't mean it's the right explanation, and that was the one originally intended by the writers of the text. And there's probably a lot in the text that could lead us to think otherwise. So, if we're looking at things that maybe Moses had made some type of slight deviation from the exact instructions, this reminds me of the story of Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, who were killed at the opening of the tabernacle because they had brought strange fire before the Lord, which seems to have been because of some deviation from the exact instructions. That seems a little bit more in line with what we're reading here with Moses, that it was probably something like that. Still, I prefer the other explanation, that Moses was the one who was getting out of line by expressing anger when he was not, when he shouldn't have done that and was not authorized to get angry like that. Okay, next let's look at Chananel. This is Chananel ben Husiel. He lived in the 11th century in Kairouan in modern-day Tunisia. Rabbi Chananel, he was joined by Rambam in holding that the key words are Moses' rhetorical question, shall we bring forth water? And the implication being here that Aaron also had the power to produce water, and that what Moses should have said is, shall the Lord bring forth? And that would explain why God said that Moses and Aaron had not sanctified the name of the Lord. This is very similar. This is probably closest to the explanation that I was most accustomed to growing up. I think I had heard it in church. It seems like a pretty good explanation. So that Moses was taking glory to himself, or that both Moses and Aaron were taking glory to themselves, when really they should have been attributing this power to the Lord, that it wasn't the power of man, it wasn't the power of the staff, that they had to remember, okay, this was the power of the Lord that was behind all of this, and that they had deviated from that in some way. Okay, and then one more rabbi and explanation that we'll look at. This is from Abarbanel, Yitzhak ben Yehuda Abarbanel. He was born in Lisbon, Portugal, and died in Venice. He lived from 1437 to 1508. So he agreed with Rashi that there was this immediate cause that Moses struck the rock, right when he was supposed to have spoken to the rock. But he also holds that there's an underlying cause. So Moses and Aaron had erred before, but God did not call him to account until after this particular sin. So Aaron had had a hand in making the golden calf. That's a famous one, which had caused national suffering. Moses had dispatched the spies, whose false report had brought about the 40 years of wandering and the death of an entire generation. It would have seemed unfair for the nation not to enter into the land, but for Moses and Aaron to do so. Therefore, when they committed a sin that was worthy of a punishment of some sort, God chose to keep them out of the land like the rest of their generation. So this is looking at it a little differently than the way I would generally think of it. I think of Moses and all that he had done, and all that he had sacrificed, and it seems kind of unfair that he wasn't able to enter into the land of Israel, where Abarbanel is looking at this and saying, well, okay, the whole nation was punished, and it wouldn't be fair for Moses and Aaron to be able to enter the land. So it's kind of the opposite perspective of what I would naturally have. But you can see the logic behind there. So that there had been this... There had been some problems accruing for quite some time, and then once this happened, maybe it wasn't enough by itself, but on top of everything else that had happened, God had said, okay, you're going to have to share the same fate as the rest of the nation and not be allowed to enter the land. So what do we make of all this? What is the ultimate answer? Where do I come on down on this? I have no idea. I think it's pretty interesting, all the different answers that are given. And I guess if I were to be asked, okay, why wasn't Moses allowed to enter the promised land? I would just maybe refer to all these answers and just say, okay, these are what lots of people have said. Over the years, I think even Ezra was right to say, okay, this is a big mystery. And on the bright side, it being a big mystery and inconclusive means that we get to have lots of people talking about it over the generations, and stuff that we can read through. And for somebody who's interested in Torah and in the Middle Ages, medieval Judaism, and in all the commentaries on it, well, that's all the better for me. But I'll leave that to all of you to consider what you think, why Moses was prohibited from entering. And I'd like to thank you for listening, and I'll catch you next time.